My name is Robert Allinson, and I want to express my appreciation to be invited to this marvelous convocation and to express my gratitude in particular to Dragos and Alex and Lynn and to the university for hosting this great conference. The title of my paper is The Possibility of a Humane Global Civilization for the 21st Century and Beyond. And I developed this thesis in contradistinction to the ideas of Samuel Huntington, who's well known for his concepts of the clash of civilizations. The thesis I should like to advance today, as a philosopher and an ethicist, is that ethical relations are indeed the starting point of a civilization. As much as we might alter the specific structures of society, such as political or educational opportunities, or economic opportunities, I contend that no country can count itself as civilized unless it has in place an honest, just, fair, respectful, and non-harm-doing, non-violent mode of human relations, as well as our relations to nature, as the foundation of all political and organizational structures. Since the phrase nonviolence has become so commonly used as to lose much of its emotional connotation and therefore its meaning, let us use ahimsa, non-harm-doing, its original cognate. Ahimsa is a word that comes from Jain philosophy, made famous by its appropriation by Mahatma Gandhi. It means non-harm-doing. So my contention is that political structures, whether democratic or non-democratic, cannot function properly without a priority given to ethical considerations. In the best of democratic societies, the principles of participatory democracy can be easily warped by unethical motivations, undermining the democratic processes. For example, interfering, like in the US, with calculating votes through gerrymandering destroys representative democracy. For classical Greek philosophy, especially through the eyes of Plato and his student Aristotle, one could never achieve an ethical society without proper political structures. Ethics was not considered to be functional on its own. Ethical behavior could only come into being within the right sort of political organizations. In Plato's pithy and memorable phrase, his republic was justice, writ large, justice as an ethical concept. Today in the global community, we must consider reversing Plato's order, in which ethics can only be fulfilled through politics, to the priority that politics can only properly function if it's governed by ethics. Today's world is different. The role of personal ethics today is not something that can be taken for granted. Since the European Enlightenment of the 18th century, we have put democratic political structures in place that function similar to the political structures that governed ancient Greece and Rome. Ethics, however, has largely been absent. Politics can only function to achieve egalitarianism, freedom, security, health care, senior care, and subsistence for all of its citizens if its citizenry is strongly and very consistently motivated by ethical intentions. During the European Enlightenment, notable progress was made through the reform of political structures. In the works of Montesquieu, in particular, the notion of the separation of powers to achieve a balance of power was a great achievement. It created the phenomenon of countervailing powers, countering any branch of government from obtaining supremacy and consequent domination. The problem in the 21st century is that unethical behavior has undermined the efficacy of countervailing powers. To use an example from the US, the Supreme Court loses its stature as an independent, objective counsel when its members succumb to influence by politically partisan billionaires. The House of Representatives and the Senate lose their ability to work together to support, or if needs be, to deter the power of the executive when its members are influenced by big pharmacy, the tobacco industry, and the National Rifle Association. In short, the core lack of ethics cripples democracy. Oligarchy replaces democracy. Further erosions of the rule of democracy have come into being by the power of mob rule. That was what Plato feared as the ultimate fate of democracy. What can constrain the masses who are not governed by political countervailing powers? The ultimate example was the invasion of the Capitol in the U.S. by unconstrained masses of people. What is to constrain such events? The lack of the ultimacy of the principle of non-harm doing is the real problem, not the failure of democracy. Democracy cannot function without ethics. For Rousseau, the 18th century French thinker Kant thought so highly of that his portrait was hung above his desk, wrote that it was civilization that warped mankind. In the state of nature, Rousseau asserted, human beings were filled with cooperation and kindness. As men came into association with each other under the guise of civilization, selfishness and greed came into being. The question then is, what is the nature of human beings in their natural state? What exactly is human nature? I wonder if we can take clues from the animal kingdom. What characterizes most animals, other than humans, is their cooperative and altruistic natures concerning relations among their own kind, their own species. Dolphins are known to swim under injured or sick dolphins to keep them afloat. As they're mammals, they can't breathe underwater, and prevent them from drowning. Jane Goodall, that remarkable anthropologist, recounts in her well-known book, Through a Window, My 30 Years with the Chimpanzees of Gamba, the story of a chimpanzee, no relative of the victim he rescues, diving into a river to save a young chimpanzee from drowning. There are tales of elephants working together to drag their peers overcome by sunstroke and having collapsed away from the sun and under the shade of a tree to protect them from dying from the relentless heat. My point is, if this characterizes the behavior of animals in the wild, why should human animals' behavior be any different? For Rousseau, compassion is inborn in the human being. Compassion occurs prior to reflection. In this concept, Rousseau is at one with Mencius, Mengzi, the great Chinese Confucian philosopher of the 4th century BCE, whose book, the Mencius, or Mengzi, is one of the classic 4 books that for many centuries formed the cornerstone of Chinese education. It is only when human beings attempt to construct a society, an artificial structure, that they become removed from their gentle nature. What then can we do? Shall we retreat to the jungles, the rainforests, or the deserts? No, this is not the answer, although the extremes of climate in the years to come, or the ravages that are the outcome of a nuclear war, may force us to do so. In the meantime, our only recourse is to establish the right sort of civilization, a civilization that does not permit or enable violence or harm doing. The important lessons to be taught are ethical lessons. We need to instill and repeatedly educate unequivocal ethical values that our civilization has torn asunder. Recently, a study of 1-year-old babies at the Infant Cognition Center of Yale University has demonstrated that infants are born with a sense of right and wrong, and when tests are given, the infants, prior to learning language or being exposed to education, tend to choose right behavior, that is ethical, other-directed behavior, over wrong behavior, that is selfish behavior that hurts others. Rousseau had an important point. The wrong sort of civilization, the kind of civilization that sanctions aggressive competition, that rewards success obtained at nearly any ethical cost, corrupts humankind. Mencius, with his famous example of the child in the well, knew this long before Rousseau in the 4th century BCE. In Mencius's justly famous example, his argument was that the human being, untainted by civilization, was prompted by altruistic motivations. In my modern reconstruction of this argument, his argument was phenomenological. That is, everyone was encouraged to imagine the situation and see how she or he would feel. Everyone was to imagine a child, not a relative, about to fall into a well Let's reconstruct this. Let's imagine the child at 5 years old. We update the example to a child running into the street, about to be struck by an oncoming car. Mencius asks us to introspect and discover what feelings are spontaneously aroused by us, in us. He claims that we will be affected by the feelings of alarm and compassion. Interestingly enough, coinciding with Aristotle's claim of what feelings are aroused by the spectator of tragedy. In short, every human being, unaffected by thinking about the impact of their action by the judgment of others, possesses an altruistic nature. That is, full of compassion for every human being in suffering or danger. That such emotions arise in every person suddenly, in Mencius' example, mitigates against the idea that such emotions are the result of reflection, reason, or thinking. Mencius' idea supports Rousseau. Mencius even illustrates what happens when civilization disrupts nature. He gives the example of a mountain, once green, decimated by axes and hoes, becoming bald. Nowadays, the technologies of strip mining, surface coal extraction, oil shale mining, open pit mining provide even more graphic evidence of environmental destruction. However, it is not technology alone that Mencius is pointing to as the culprit. Technology is also a metaphor for tampering with nature, in this case, the nature of the human being. The human being will be stripped of its green shoots, the sprouts of its core essential ethical nature. The methods today include even more sophisticated weapons than axes. Now there are digital axes, axes of social media, spouting untruths and encouraging violence through video games. Of course, what I'm saying is debatable. The Chinese thinker Zhuangzi thought the opposite of Mencius. He thought that the human being was born evil, as he states in his own works, born with envy and greed. From my perspective, I have recourse to Rousseau. For Rousseau, envy comes into being only in civilization, greed as well. One becomes greedy to make sure she or he possesses more than the next person. In the state of nature, there's no need to obsessively compete with others. Has anyone ever seen an obese coyote, tiger, or deer? Animals have no desire to eat beyond what their body needs. They are not driven by envy. Hunger, in my example, is a metaphor. In general, animals are not by nature in competition with members of their own species. Of course, males do combat with each other in competition for mates, but this is a special behavior confined to this life cycle. Even here, the fights do not end in violent killings. They end in one male giving in to the other. That is all. The point is that civilization requires that human beings, as the famed late novelist Kurt Vonnegut says, be kind to each other. It is as simple as that. In Buddhist language, echoed by the late Albert Schweitzer, we must show compassion to all sentient beings. In today's world, we even must go further. We must show compassion to all beings, including non-sentient beings. We must also consider another extremely important point. When we speak of human nature, we do not need to be purely descriptive. If we remain descriptive in our account, we can only point to history, which, as Simon Wiesenthal has described, is the story of man's inhumanity to man. The investigation of human nature possesses a unique characteristic in which the subject and the object of our inquiry are the same. We are not mere objects of study. We are subjects, that is, active agents. We can make our nature what it is, what we want it to be. We're not simply passive recipients. We shall return to this point later on. Our modern society, governed by unbridled capitalism, mitigates against ethical principles. It is difficult to achieve an ethical society under unbridled capitalist civilization. An ethical world would be a world in which there would be no poverty, Now 50% of the human race lives in poverty. There's an abundance of poverty. What we don't normally understand is every instance of poverty, hunger, malnutrition, disease, or lack of shelter, lack of good water, is an example of harm doing. For all of these conditions are preventable. The lack of action by the human community on behalf of those deprived is an act of violence. There is no such thing as a bystander. Every bystander is an accomplice. We live in a most violent society, a society of widespread harm doing, a civilization of violence. Can we call this civilization? Have we ever even reached civilization? There are other dangers which I've mentioned. The danger of climate chaos. This is often brought about by the cooperative violence of governments and giant transnational corporations. Scientific evidence mounts. There are clear and present dangers. The glaciers will melt to the point of flooding our coastal cities. Tornadoes, floods, tsunamis, hurricanes, and typhoons will devastate our cities. Heat will dry up crops. Many places where human beings now live will become uninhabitable. And then what will be the behavior of those who have versus those who have not? The violence that we now see emerging will be magnified 1,000-fold. Civilization, now a distant dream, will become totally impossible. Dystopia of the worst possible kind imaginable will become reality. So the apocryphal reply of Mahatma Gandhi, when asked what he thought of Western civilization, that it would be a good idea, will become, it once might have been a good idea, but it is now unobtainable. Then there is the ever-present looming possibility of catastrophic nuclear war. We are still in a nuclear weapons arms race. More and more new countries are obtaining and testing nuclear weapons. We may not need to wait until the climate makes our planet uninhabitable. We may beat nature to the punch. Are there any solutions? Well, there are nations working on innovative methods to halt climate deterioration. Norway has mandated electric vehicles since 2007. 80% of vehicles on Norway's roads are electric. Wonderful, but only a drop in the global ocean. It does demonstrate that we can prevent climate devastation and how to do it. This is an important first step of a baby. What of mass shootings that characterize America today? This is becoming a common reality, virtually one a day in 2023. Those enamored of the Second Amendment spread the illusory interpretation that intended to provide private citizens with any number and kind of weapons and ammunition. The English language structure can read the Second Amendment properly. The construction is that the Second Amendment means that a dependent clause modifies an independent clause. So in order to raise a militia, it reads, we must bear arms. It is for the sake of a standing army that soldiers, not private citizens, have the right to bear arms. This dates back to the historical need for states to raise standing armies, to allow these armies or militia to bear arms. Of course, no one envisioned the type of weapons for mass destruction that those who claim that they follow the Second Amendment should be their right to purchase and carry fully armed wherever they go. Even in the Wild West of America during the 19th century, when those who carried guns went into a saloon, they were required to park them by the door. The argument that mentally disturbed people are the ones who indulge in mass shootings of children in elementary school, citizens in their daily life, in movie theaters, banks, churches, synagogues, mosques, and shopping malls. But the point is, these mentally ill people could do no harm if they did not have access to weapons. In more civilized countries, in New Zealand and Australia, at the first instance of a mass shooting, weapons were banned and citizens turned in their weapons to be melted into metal, swords into plowshares. Clearly, much has to be changed, but what is most important is to start with the foundation. The foundation of a house is the most important building block. If we do not start with the right foundation, it does not matter how elaborate and how extensive is the edifice that we build. The primary foundation that has to be changed is our view of human nature. As long as we believe that human beings, by nature, are selfish brutes, prone to violence, and devoid of a caring nature, it is not likely that we'll change our practices, which strip our planet of its nature, and equally unlikely we shall give up the right to bear arms, openly and freely, to use against other human beings. For in the minds of violent people, the right to bear arms is the right to use arms. What is needed to make civilization possible is a crucial change in our ideas of the essential nature of humankind. What is needed is a deep, dedicated, consistent, and lifelong philosophical and ethical education. Plato wrote that one needed an education of over 50 years before one could be considered to be a ruler. However, whether or not self-consciously, the majority of human beings now educated in the West are Hobbesian. Whether or not they've read Hobbes, they do see man as he did, as homo lupus homo, that man is wolf to man. What we need now, prior to the revolution of society, is an inner revolution in our idea of what is man. And a very crucial ingredient here is the treatment of females. One must remake the idea that man was made first. The new her story must be that woman was made first, and man was made from the breast of the female. Does this not sound more similar to biological reality? We must avoid, as the contemporary African female philosopher Marie Ibo writes, that man has become a wolf to woman. It is important to remember, in this task of coming to know the true nature of man, that this task be philosophical and not scientific. It does not fall in the realm of artificial intelligence. In scientific methodology, we describe the object of our investigation. This is understood as an objective methodology. We do not allow subjective considerations to affect the data that we are collecting. In natural science, our human concerns do not affect the situation that when we add 2 hydrogen atoms to 1 oxygen atom, we form the molecule of water. We do not create this. It is the independent and objective work of nature. When the social scientist takes a poll of potential voters, the social scientist does not, or should not, affect the polling. She or he takes the poll of the voters and describes what she or he finds. She or he does not, or should not, alter the data to be described. In the case of the introspection of the human being, the nature of the human being is not something apart from the human being to exist and left undisturbed. The nature of the human being, as the Spanish philosopher Ortega y Gasset has written, is in the making, is a facere, not a factum, not a datum. We accept the idea of biological evolution as a scientific explanation of the development of the species. Why do we hesitate to accept the validity of the idea of a social evolution? We can become social evolutionists as well as biological evolutionists. Our ideas of ourselves must change, and this change can take place at the same time as we attempt to alter our social and political structures so that they enable ethical choices, ethical decisions, and ethical actions. We must attack on 2 fronts at once. Simone de Beauvoir originally thought that female emancipation had to wait upon social transformation. In her mature considerations, she changed her mind. She thought that female emancipation could not wait until there was social transformation. It could not afford to wait. This idea of social evolution that I'm introducing is not to be confused with social Darwinism. There are social biologists who attempt to reduce all human activities as serving the cause of biological evolution. Here, I am presenting an entirely different approach The approach of social evolution is to consider that in the case of human nature, the subject and the object of human nature are one and the same. This is a very important core philosophical concept. The object is not separate from the subject. Hence, one can prescribe as well as describe human behavior. Just as I may alter my behavior to become less selfish and more altruistic, my subjective change alters my objective change. It alters my objective nature. As Aristotle famously wrote, we become just by performing just acts. Our behavior shapes our nature. With philosophy, we do not merely describe, we prescribe. Our nature is not something static and unchangeable. It changes under our own hands. We can become evil and we can become good. As it says in Deuteronomy, I've created both good and evil, therefore choose good. This is not a logical choice, it is a moral one. There's no logic here. However, it does reveal that we have a choice. We can make things better. It is up to us to do so. The outer revolution, the change to society, the change in our eating habits, the change in the way in which we can creatively cooperate with nature, the change to ethical relations with our fellow human beings, and other sentient and non-sentient denizens of the world. This is all dependent upon an inner revolution, the revolution of understanding that our true nature is one of compassion, to be the ongoing caretaker of the world. How do we know that this is our true nature? As the philosopher Aristotle has written, the full development of something is its true nature, the fulfillment of its purpose, its telos, what it is meant to be. The full development of the acorn is the mature oak tree. The oak tree, in its maturity, is what the oak is meant to be. The acorn is not the nature of the oak tree. It is the beginning of its nature. The human being in its infancy is not the full nature of the human being. In its self-interest, its throwing of temper tantrums, the infancy of the human being resembles the current stage of nation-states, aggressively displaying their weapons and plunging from time to time into war, much as infants throw temper tantrums when they cannot get their way. The human being in maturity is actually a nurturing parent. The mature human being is a caretaker of those who are dependent upon her or him. The full and real nature of the human being is to be a caretaker. So the question is not really of this civilization or that civilization. The question is the building of a global civilization with global concerns. We must become citizens not only of one's particular nation state, but citizens of the world. A global civilization is a civilization of nations in which there is no violence, no harm doing. The sign of poverty, of homelessness, of migration on a local or a global scale is a mark of violence. We live in a time neither of a state of nature or a state of civilization. We live in a state of oozing barbarism, marked by unprecedented violence, where child soldiers have become murderers. We not only murder our children, but our children murder our adults. This is new in history. This is something new under the sun, and this is not good. We need an inner revolution, a philosophical revolution. We need to envision ourselves and our sorority and fraternity of mankind as one family, as is stated in Confucius's Analects, where all men in the four oceans are brothers. This was known long ago in the 5th century BCE. It is up to us as educators, as philosophers, as ethical global scholars, that is, lovers of wisdom. We must assume the role of the philosophical atlases of the world. We must hold up the world. For if we do not, the world will not stand on its own. Our task is to be builders, to build a global civilization. For a global civilization to come into being, it requires a plan and it requires planning. It is the philosophers of the world, those who hold the repositories of wisdom in their minds and hearts, to which we must turn. To turn to all the civilizations that have existed in the past, to mine the wisdom that all have to offer. These are the resources we have at our command. We must not turn against each other. We must cooperate with each other. We must take the wisdom of Confucius together with the insights of Rousseau and Montesquieu. In short, we need a new enlightenment. Thank you very much for listening.